transplant coordinator ran my compatibility test twice. I watched her pull up the results on her screen, go very still, and then turn quietly to the doctor standing beside her and say something I couldn't hear. The doctor looked at the screen, looked at me, and asked if I could come with them somewhere private for a few minutes. I was in that hospital because my daughter was dying, and I had come to try to save her, and I could see from the way both of them were being careful about where their eyes landed that something in my results had thrown off everything they thought they knew about who I was. My name is Paul. That matters less than what I said in that room 5 minutes later, because what those results showed didn't just stop 2 medical professionals cold, it unraveled 3 years of lies my ex-wife had told everyone, including our daughter, about why I had left. And when the coordinator asked me in a very gentle voice if I understood what the test results meant, I said 5 words back to her, 5 quiet words, and those 5 words finished a story that 3 years of silence had been holding up, and that story could not survive them. I need to stop here right now because I already know what this sounds like. It sounds like a revenge story. It isn't one. I didn't fly from Calgary to Toronto to expose anyone. I flew because my daughter needed a bone marrow donor and nobody had found a match, and I was not going to sit in my apartment watching the news while she ran out of time. What happened to my ex-wife's version of events happened because the truth finally had a reason to walk into a room where it could not be argued with, and I want to be honest that I took no satisfaction in it. By then, the only thing I cared about in the entire world was whether Zoe was going to live. So if you've ever loved a kid who was told to stop loving you back and kept loving them anyway, quietly from a distance with nothing asked in return, stay with me. This is going to hurt before it gets better. But it does get better, I promise you that. Okay, let me back up. You need to understand how a man ends up flying across the country to give bone marrow for a daughter who hasn't returned his calls in 2 years. I'm 42 years old. I've been a licensed electrician since I was 20, working commercial and industrial jobs out of Calgary for most of my adult life. It's work that's never glamorous and always necessary, and I've been good at it since the day I started. I never wanted much beyond a job and a home and a family. I got all 3, and then I got 2 of them taken. I met Laura when I was 23 years old. She was working the front desk at a property management office where I'd come to give a quote on a panel upgrade. I noticed she was wearing her jacket indoors even though the office was warm, and that she had the particular kind of exhaustion in her face that goes past one bad night. We ended up talking for half an hour after I finished the paperwork. She was direct and funny and a little guarded, and I liked all 3 of those things immediately. I need to tell you what I knew when we met, because everything in this story turns on it. Laura was 4 months pregnant. The man who had gotten her pregnant had decided when she told him that he'd rather relocate to Vancouver than become a father. He was gone before she'd finished telling him. She was working full-time, living in a 1-bedroom apartment in the northeast part of the city, carrying a baby on her own and trying to figure out how all of it was going to work. She told me on our second date, at a diner on McLeod Trail on a Tuesday night in November. She said if it was going to change things, she'd rather know now. It didn't change things. I've asked myself why 100 times over the years, and the answer is always the same. I didn't fall for a situation, I fell for Laura, and the baby was coming into the world regardless of what I did, and something in me sitting across from her in that booth just decided. I can't explain it better than that. Those 2 words, just decided, are the whole thing. I decided that baby was going to have somebody. I knew with complete clarity and from that very first night that the child Laura was carrying was not mine biologically. There was never a gray area, never a moment of confusion I was managing. I knew exactly whose child she was not, and I chose to be her father anyway. Zoe was born in March at the Foothills Hospital. I was in the delivery room. I cut the cord. I was the first person besides the nurses to hold her, and she was small and furious about being in the world, and she grabbed my index finger with her whole hand, and that was completely it for me. Whatever the biology said, I was her father, not as a concept or a plan, as a fact. Standing in that delivery room, I was her father, and she was mine, and it was as simple and as permanent as anything I've ever known. Laura and I got married when Zoe was 8 months old. We bought a house in the southwest end of the city, modest, needed some work, which I did on weekends over the first 2 years. I want you to see what we had, because you need to understand what it actually cost when it was taken. I taught Zoe to skate at the outdoor rink at the community center down the street. She was 4 years old and she spent the entire first hour falling, and the second hour deciding that falling was no longer acceptable, and then she skated, just pushed off and went. I had to jog to keep up. I remember thinking, standing at the boards watching her go, that is entirely your kid, that stubbornness, that refusal to be defeated by a thing she'd decided she was going to do, yours. I was at every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every soccer game where she sat on the bench for 3 quarters and then sprinted like her life depended on it in the last 15 minutes. I coached her house league team for 2 seasons. I drove her to tournaments in Lethbridge and Red Deer in February, heater at full blast, Zoe asleep in the back seat with her cleats still on, a Tim Hortons cup going cold in the cup holder. There is one night I think about more than any other. Zoe was 6 weeks old and she had colic, that specific brand of infant misery that starts around midnight and doesn't stop until it decides to. Laura had been up with her 3 nights in a row and was running on empty. I told her to go sleep. I had it. And I spent 3 hours walking laps in our living room with Zoe against my chest, patting her back, talking to her quietly, about nothing, about the job I had that week, about the Flames game I'd missed, just giving her a voice to follow in the dark. Around 3:30 in the morning, she finally went limp and heavy against my shoulder, completely worn out. I stood in the middle of that room, afraid to move, and I looked down at this tiny, furious person who the whole world would tell you was not mine. And I felt a love so complete it scared me. That was the night I stopped thinking of what I was doing as a choice and started knowing it as a fact. She was mine. Biology is a record. Fatherhood is what you do at 3 in the morning in the dark when no one is watching and no one will ever know, and I had signed up for every minute of it. Laura and I were happy for a long time, real, ordinary, quiet happy, and then somewhere in the last few years of the marriage she changed. I've spent a long time trying to understand it, and I've stopped reaching for a clean explanation. She got a new job with a property development firm, a different environment, a different scale of income and ambition. And I think she started to look at our life, the house in the Southwest, the truck in the driveway, the electrician's schedule, and see something she'd settled for rather than something she'd chosen. She asked for a divorce when Zoe was 14. I was heartbroken, but I understood. People change. I would have done it the decent way, shared time with Zoe, stayed involved, kept things civil. That is not what happened. Laura wanted a clean break. She was already involved with someone else, a property developer with considerably more money and a considerably simpler personal history, meaning no complicated step-parent arrangements and no ex-husband in the rotation. And she knew something about me that she decided to use. She knew that Zoe's adoption had never been legally finalized. We had started the paperwork years earlier, paid the retainer, filled out the forms, and then put it off the way you put off things you think you have time for. When the marriage ended, I had no legal standing as Zoe's parent. Laura knew that. And she made it quietly clear, never said directly, never said on record, that if I pushed for formal custody arrangements, the circumstances of Zoe's parentage would become part of the proceedings. That Zoe would find out in the middle of a court fight that the man she'd called Dad her whole life had no biological connection and no legal claim. I knew what that could do to a 14-year-old. I had spent 14 years making sure Zoe never felt like an asterisk in her own story. I was not going to let a family courtroom undo that to satisfy my need to fight back. So I didn't fight. God help me, I didn't fight. I told myself I'd stay close informally, that I'd see Zoe on weekends, work it out between us like adults, and for a while that held shakily. And then Laura started managing my access the way you manage a problem you're hoping will eventually just go away on its own. And then one Sunday evening I got a text. I still have it. It said, "Zoe's been speaking to her counselor about the back and forth. She needs some space to process things. Please respect that for now." I read it sitting in the parking lot of a Canadian Tire off Glenmore Trail. I put my phone on the passenger seat. I sat there for a long time, not crying, not angry, just hollow, like something structural inside me had quietly given out. Because the cruelest part wasn't the message. The cruelest part was how close I came to believing it. Zoe had been quieter the last few visits. She was a teenager. Teenagers go quiet. But suddenly I was going back through every visit, every strained conversation, every moment she'd looked at her phone instead of at me, and I was wondering if all of it had been obligation. If I'd been telling myself a story about a relationship that had ended for her months ago without my noticing. A man who's already been told he has no legal standing will believe almost anything about his own inadequacy. The message counted on that, and it worked. I backed off. I stopped pushing when calls went unanswered. I stopped showing up when the door didn't open. I told myself I was giving her space. The truth is I was a man who'd been told to disappear and had done it because I didn't know what else I was allowed to do. For 3 years I didn't see my daughter. I'm not proud of that. I need to say it plainly. 3 years. Zoe went from 14 to 17 to finishing high school at her grandmother's kitchen table on a video call during COVID restrictions, and I watched none of it. I knew her birthday because I always knew her birthday. I knew when she graduated because Laura's younger sister Kim, the only person in that family who'd ever kept my number, sent me a photo without comment. Zoe in a navy dress, holding flowers, grinning. I still have it. There was one afternoon, maybe 18 months into the silence, when I saw her. I was coming out of a grocery store in our old neighborhood, and she was across the parking lot with a group of friends. She'd grown. She looked like herself, but more so. And for 1 second our eyes met across all that distance. I stopped walking. She looked away, back to her friends, like she hadn't seen me, or like she had and didn't know what to do with it. I got to my truck and I sat there and I told myself, there's your answer. That's what she wants. I know now what was going through her mind in that parking lot. I know she'd been told I had stepped back voluntarily, that the arrangement had been too complicated for me, that I'd chosen at some point to simplify my life. She was a teenager who'd been handed that story by the one person whose version of things she trusted most, and she'd built something around it to explain why her dad didn't call anymore. She was probably as frozen as I was, standing there not knowing what to do with the sight of the man she'd been told had decided she was too complicated. But I didn't know that then it just about finished me. And then on a Wednesday morning in October, I was up on a scissor lift at a job site in the Northeast, running conduit, hands full, and my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I've thought 100 times about how close I came to letting it go. It was Kim. Her voice was wrong from the first word. She said, "Paul, I'm so sorry to call. I didn't know if I should, but you need to know. It's Zoe." Zoe had been in a car accident on the 401, coming back to Guelph from a weekend in Toronto. Black ice, a transport truck, a guardrail. She'd been in surgery. She had survived the surgery. But the trauma had triggered something, aplastic anemia, the doctors called it, where the bone marrow stops producing enough healthy blood cells. In Zoe's case, it was severe, and the recommended treatment was a stem cell transplant, and they were having trouble finding a match. They'd tested Laura, not compatible enough. They'd searched the Canadian Blood Services donor registry. Nothing close enough, nothing in time. A window opens when you get the patient stabilized, and if there's no donor ready when the window opens, the window closes, and Caleb's window, Zoe's window, was running. Kim was calling against her sister's wishes, she said, because nobody had thought to test me. I was down from that lift before she'd finished the sentence. I want to be honest about what I knew driving to the airport, because it's the part that makes what I did mean something. I knew I wasn't a biological match. I knew it with total certainty. I knew that when they ran my blood, it would show no biological relationship to Zoe because there is none. I also knew that the question of who was actually her biological father would have to be addressed. And the story Laura had spent 3 years telling, that I was a name from the past who had chosen to step back, a non-issue, a complication she'd managed, that story could not survive a man who had just flown across the country and rolled up his sleeve. I booked a WestJet flight to Toronto for the next morning. I did not slow down. Because 15 years of being Zoe's father had taught me one thing clearly enough that it no longer required thinking about. There is no secret and no pride and no version of self-protection that a real father won't set on fire for his child. The story didn't matter. Nothing mattered except Zoe. When I got to the hospital, Laura was in the family waiting area. I'll never forget her face when she saw me come through those doors. She understood instantly what my being there meant. She came across the room fast and quiet and said, "You can't be here, Paul. You don't have any standing here. You can't just walk in and she couldn't finish the sentence because the end of it was the thing she'd spent 3 years protecting. I looked at her. I had spent 3 years carrying a version of this woman in my head, the woman who'd sent that text, who'd managed me out of my daughter's life with a message about counselors and space. The person in front of me looked smaller than that version, and older, and frightened. I didn't feel angry. I felt very tired and very clear. I said, "Zoe needs a donor, Laura. I'm going to get tested. I think you know that's the right thing." Something moved across her face. Then she stepped back. I don't think she could have stopped me. I went to the nursing station and told them I was there to be evaluated as a potential donor for my daughter. The transplant coordinator who ran my tests was Dr. Nakamura. She was methodical and careful and clearly good at what she did. I watched her when the results came up. I watched her look at them. I watched her look at them again. I watched her cross-reference something on the screen. And then she asked me to come with her. We sat in a small consultation room. She folded her hands. She said, "The results are going to be difficult to hear, and I want you to have support available." And I already knew. I had always known. So I saved her the difficulty of saying it. I said, "I'm not her biological father. That's what the test shows." She stopped. The careful professional composure shifted into something unscripted. She said, "Yes, that's correct. I'm so sorry. This must be..." And I said the 5 words, the ones that ended 3 years of someone else's story. I said, "I know. She's still mine." She went quiet. I watched her understand slowly what she was actually looking at. Not a man whose world had just collapsed. A man who had known from the beginning, who had stood in a delivery room and made a decision and then kept making it every day for 14 years, who had flown across the country and walked into a test that was always going to surface this truth because being in that room for Zoe mattered more than any secret. She sat back in her chair. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very softly, "She's very lucky to have you." I had to look at the wall for a second, because that was the first time in 3 years anyone had said anything like that to me. What happened next happened without confrontation or drama. The medical team needed to understand the full family history to redirect the donor search. Non-biological parentage matters when you're looking for a stem cell match because it points the search in a different direction. So there were conversations, careful and clinical and matter-of-fact, in which the actual shape of our family got laid out plainly by people whose only interest was saving Zoe, that I had been her father from her first day, that I had raised her for 14 years, that I was the person who had driven to the airport the morning after Kim's call, that her biological father had left before she was born and had never been a part of her life. Laura had to sit in those rooms. She couldn't shape those conversations. You cannot spin a doctor whose entire focus is finding a donor. The facts were what they were, and the facts told a story that was the direct opposite of the one she had been telling for 3 years. Her story was that I was a figure from the past who had chosen to simplify his life. The facts said I had been Zoe's father in every practical and emotional sense for her entire life, had flown from Calgary to Toronto the moment I heard she needed help, and had submitted to a test I knew would cost me the one secret I had spent years protecting, because being there for Zoe was worth more to me than any of it. There is no version of that where I'm the one who walked away, and everyone in those rooms knew it, and Laura knew that they knew it. They let me see Zoe 2 days later once she was stable enough. Walking into that room was the hardest thing I have ever done. The last real information I had about how Zoe felt about me was that text message, the counselor, the space, the suggestion that my presence was a complication she was working through. I didn't know what I would find on her face. Zoe was in the bed. The accident and the blood condition had taken some weight and all the color from her cheeks, and she looked younger than 19 and older than 19 at the same time, the way people look when they've been through something real. Her hair was different, her eyes were exactly the same. She looked up when I came through the door, and her face did something complicated, confusion and disbelief, and something underneath both of them that I recognized but was afraid to name. And then she said, "Dad." Just that word, just the one. I crossed that room. I sat on the edge of the bed and put my arms around her carefully because there were lines and monitors everywhere, and I was terrified of pulling something. And she grabbed the back of my shirt with both hands and held on for a long time. We didn't say much. There wasn't much that needed to be said that wasn't already being said by the fact of us being in that room together. Over the 2 days before they let me see her, Kim had told her everything, the whole picture, not the curated version, that I had been there from the beginning, that the legal adoption had never been completed, but the fatherhood had been, in every way that actually counted, that I had flown from Calgary the morning after Kim called, that I had walked into a test I knew could not match me biologically, because being in that hospital for her was worth more to me than the secret I'd been sitting on for 3 years. She told me, in that hospital room, the truth about what those 3 years had looked like from her side. She had never told a counselor the back and forth was too much. She had never said she needed space. She had been given the message in various forms, over various months, that I had found the arrangement complicated and had chosen to simplify my life. And because she was 14 and then 15 and then 16 and the man she'd thought of as her dad wasn't calling anymore, she had built an explanation around it. She told herself I'd never been fully certain about her, that a father without a biological claim was always eventually going to drift back toward something that felt more real. She'd carried that for 3 years, built her whole understanding of why I'd gone quiet on top of it. And I had believed a text message and disappeared and left her in that architecture alone. Neither of us had stopped wanting the other. We had each just been made to believe the other one had stopped first. I don't have the words for what it is to find out that 3 years of grief were manufactured, that your daughter never stopped loving you, that the silence was constructed deliberately by someone with a very specific interest in keeping it. I felt relief and joy and a rage so quiet it scared me all at the same time. I've had to learn to hold all of it without letting any one of them make my decisions for me. I was at that hospital for 6 weeks. I slept at a hotel 3 blocks away and spent every day with Zoe that she was well enough to have someone in the room. We had years to catch up on, and it turned out we didn't need to talk through most of it. We watched whatever was on the hospital TV. I brought 2 large double-doubles from the Tim Hortons down the street every morning. We talked about her program, Environmental Science, University of Guelph. She cared about it in that specific way that means it was her idea and not something anyone steered her toward, and about her friends and about what she wanted to do after graduation. Forward, not back. The donor match came through the Canadian Blood Services Registry. A man in Winnipeg who had registered years earlier and probably hadn't thought about it since. When they called him, he said yes immediately. He flew to Toronto. A complete stranger who owed Zoe absolutely nothing gave a piece of himself to save her life. I've thought about that a great deal since then, My daughter was raised by a man with no biological claim and saved by a stranger with no personal connection. The things that kept her alive had nothing to do with blood in the way we usually mean it. A stranger chose to show up. A father chose to stay. Those choices, not the biology, are what she's alive for. If you take one thing from all of this, take that one. Zoe is 20 now. The transplant worked. She finished her first year remotely while she recovered and went back to Guelph in September. She plays on a recreational soccer league and she is genuinely furious when her team loses, which is a quality I recognize completely. We have real time together now, the kind we should have had from the start. She's in Guelph during the school year, but she's in Calgary every summer and every Christmas, and my apartment has her things in it, her cleats by the door, her jacket on the hook, the specific productive chaos of a 20-year-old who actually lives somewhere. 3 years ago I thought I had lost her for good. Now I watch her fall asleep on my couch with a textbook open on her chest and I feel something so large I genuinely do not have a word that fits it. Laura came to find me once near the end of Zoe's recovery. She caught me in a hospital corridor and she looked worn down in a way I hadn't seen before. She said she was sorry. I could tell it cost her to say it. I could also tell she knew it wasn't enough and that she knew I knew it. She said she'd told herself for 3 years that she was doing what was best for Zoe, a clean start, less confusion, and that watching me walk into that hospital, knowing what the test would show, knowing what it would cost, had shown her what she'd actually done in a light she couldn't look away from. I didn't say much in return. There wasn't much that needed saying. I told her the only thing that mattered from there on, we both had to be good parents to Zoe from this point forward, that I wasn't interested in a war. She nodded. She cried a little. She went back down the hall. That was the closest we've ever come to settling it. It's probably the closest we ever will. I don't hate her. I want to say that because it's true, and because hating her would slowly poison the thing I've gotten back, and what I've gotten back is worth more than being right about anything. She's Zoe's mother. Zoe needs her. What happened between us is ours to work through, not Zoe's to carry. Let me leave you with this, and then a question. Because I do read the comments, and I mean that. For years I kept what I knew a secret because I was afraid the truth would wound my daughter, that knowing I had no biological connection and no legal paperwork would make her feel like the ground underneath her had been softer than she'd believed, that it would undo something. I was wrong. When the truth came out, not in a courtroom, not in an ugly fight, but in a hospital room where a doctor needed to understand who we actually were, it didn't make Zoe feel less claimed, it made her feel the opposite. Because the truth wasn't, your father had no real connection to you. The truth was, a man with no obligation and no biological pull and no legal requirement looked at you the day you were born and decided you were his, and made that decision again every single day for 14 years, and flew across the country the moment you needed him, knowing it would surface the one secret he'd been protecting your whole life, because being in that hospital for you was worth more to him than any of it. That's not a truth that wounds a kid. That's a truth that tells a kid she was wanted so completely that someone signed up for her with his eyes open, knowing everything and never looked back. I spent years afraid of the one thing that, once she knew it, healed us both. So here's my question, and I genuinely want your answer. Is there a truth you've been keeping from someone you love? Something you've been protecting them from, when maybe it's the exact thing that would finally set you both free? Tell me. I read everyone. And before you go, do one thing that isn't for me. Go look up how to register as a bone marrow donor through Canadian Blood Services. It takes about 5 minutes and a cheek swab. Somewhere out there is a kid, probably someone's whole world, who is running out of time and waiting on someone exactly like you deciding to show up for a stranger. My daughter is alive because a man in Winnipeg decided to do that years ago for someone he had never met. Last August, Zoe came home for the summer. On her second day back, she asked me to take her to the outdoor rink at the community center. Same rink, same ice. She laced up her skates in about 45 seconds and pushed off without looking back. I jogged to keep up, same as always.